In this lesson, we are amplifying a little bit upon the phenomenon known as art criticism. And at a different lesson, we discussed separate Native American art histories. And we're going to look in a little bit more detail then at this phenomenon known as art critique and ways that we need to rethink it when it relates to contemporary, and for that matter, historic Native American art. That if you were to, into Google, for example, type Native American art criticism, I think there would be some surprising results as to who is doing the critique or what type of critique out there is available to view. But to really look at Native American art criticism, we're going to have to look at first the phenomenon known as art criticism. Now, if we were to look at art as being, in many ways, a socio-cultural designation of objects, ideas, behaviors that are tangible, intangible, what this means is that society itself actually has, in many ways, designated certain classes of objects, certain types of ideas. For example, when we're looking at performance art, behaviors, which would include performance art. So it's not just objects, but it's things that can be, you can actually touch them or look at them, or they may be things that are intangible, such as song is intangible. Although you can record it, I mean, you really can't see a song, although you can see the music for it. So tangible, something that is actually physically present. Intangible is something that is not physically present, that you can't really touch. And these are all fall within the purview of art criticism now. So this includes the ephemeral. The ephemeral being things that are here only for a short period of time, and if you weren't there when it was happening, then you missed the artistic event. There is an exhibit, for example, at the National Museum of the American Indian, Always Becoming, by Nora Naranjo Morse, is what we would call ephemeral, because that exhibit, that installation, is decaying, and after a while, it will no longer be there. There were works done by contemporary artists such as Joseph Du Bois, that were what we, you had to be there during the week that the installations were done, or you missed them. So this notion of art it goes beyond physical objects, and this is what we're looking at with Native American artists too. Be it installations, be it performance art, or actual paintings and the like that contemporary artists are accomplishing. So this involves, though, decisions by the artists and observers too. Critique does, as does art. And we also have to consider, particularly when we're looking at historic objects that are now called Native American art, that are some objects that are now in museums that are designated as art, but weren't considered as such by the people who created them originally. So art itself is a very difficult term to come to grips with. And there's an oft-repeated statement, there is no word in Navajo, for example, for art. Although there are words actually to designate beauty or things that are pleasing to the eye, things that would have been enjoyable for people to look at. So we have to look at also the language itself, and a lot of the art criticism is shaped by language, and also the culture from which the criticism is emerging. So art criticism really is a discussion or an evaluation of visual art. Now critics, who usually are not artists, usually criticize art in the context of the aesthetics or perceptions of beauty, or the theory of beauty. So there's usually, actually there is, not usually, there always is, a system of aesthetics, a system of a way of viewing things that's in place in art criticism. And one of the goals of art critic then, or art critique, is to establish, or for that matter to maintain, a rational and understandable, a reliable basis for art appreciation, for people to look at work and understand it, to appreciate it, and to be able to distinguish what is good or bad art, possibly, or mediocre, or what are the qualities of a piece that move you. This is an important part of criticism. And different art movements, as well as genres, actually require different criteria. You're going to evaluate ephemeral art, you're going to evaluate performance art on a different set of criteria than you would paintings. And you're going to evaluate paintings on a different set of criteria than you would sculpture, than you would music. All right, so each of the genres as well as different movements, because you would look at Impressionist art in a very different manner than you would Surrealistic art, or in a very different way than you would look at pop art or appropriative art. They all have different criteria. So another important awareness to have is that this distinction between historical criticism, when we are looking at objects from the past, and in many ways the aesthetic standards and the genre standards have already been in place for a long time. They have been established for a long period of time, and so they are commonly accepted standards when you're looking at historical criticism, as compared to contemporary criticism, where the standards are much more fluid. They're much more malleable, they're much more changeable, they're much more now, all right, they're much more volatile. And so art criticism, we need to be aware also of this distinction when we're looking at historical versus contemporary work. And this is going to be very important then when we're talking about Native American art criticism and Native American art critics in contemporary sense, because the standards that are used in contemporary work very often were similar standards to those that were used in historic, but not always. So as I carry on with this elaboration of art criticism, that being a good art critic does require not only historical awareness, in other words, the period and time in which a piece is created, but also a contextual awareness, where the piece actually was created. And that includes not only the artist, but it could be the city, it could be the salon, as well as the culture in which works came. And it also requires an awareness of various issues that are associated with art history. And that includes issues, for example, like gender bias, which were very prevalent in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even into the 20th century. That women could not make art, that women were good craftspeople, but they weren't considered artists. In the United States, if you wanted to become, for example, Mary Cassatt had to go to France in order to become an Impressionist painter, to be appreciated as one. Irony being that there were potters such as Nampeo of Hano, a Hopi potter, who became famous disproportionate to her talent as a woman artist, because she happened to be working with an anthropologist who was publishing work that was using her work as illustrations. Or she was also photographed by Edward Sheriff Curtis. So this is some of the irony when we're looking at issues, because those are also intercultural issues. That art criticism also means that you're appreciating the significance of the work, and this is going to involve being able to identify it, to describe it, as well as interpret what is in the work. So this, to some degree, is an awareness of if you're within a certain style of painting and within a certain genre of painting and working with a certain artist, that you know a lot about this artist, so you can interpret what this artist is doing in this particular work or in this particular time in their life. You need to be able to assess the expressive properties, as well as be able to make judgments about a work's personal and social values. In other words, you need to be able to discuss how well a piece succeeds in communicating a message either about the artist or about the audience or about social constructions, about social issues, right? Or for that matter, is it just art for art's sake? All right, what is it the artist is communicating? And how is it being expressed by the artist? And does the artist succeed in doing so? Or does it cause a critic as well as other viewers to stand there and just scratch their head and say, what the hell is that? But in art criticism, nothing is certain. All right, that art criticism is very opinion laden. It's opinion that is supported by historic fact, as well as contemporary fact, things that are accepted to be true. However, it's still someone's opinion, because ultimately they're saying, is a piece of work good or not? Does it communicate successfully or not? Right? That's kind of what art criticism is about. So the opinions of current art are subject to correction as well as rejection over time, because the opinions that are held today may change. There were artists who were laughed at in the Impressionist period who are now venerated. So we need to be aware. There were artists who were laughed at in Dada period who are now venerated. So this is why we need to be aware that the opinions are going to be corrected, they're going to be modified, or even rejected over time. And that some work that was seen as being very valuable at one time is now seen as invaluable. So yes, past critics sometimes ridiculed or favored artists or movements that are no longer favored, or they may have dismissed artists who are now revered, such as the early Impressionists. So nothing is certain, nothing is forever, even in art criticism and even when it's in historical art criticism. So what are the critical skills that you would need as an art critic? Because many art critics don't do art; they describe art. They criticize it. All right? So you need to be able to identify what it is you're looking at and be able to describe it in terms that the art world can understand. All right? So it's not just you as the critic, but also terms that are communicable across yourself to other art critics, but also to a reading public as well as to artists. You need to be able to analyze what you're looking at. You need to be able to interpret what you're looking at or listening to. And you need to be able to judge, to be able to evaluate the worth. These are important skills in critical thinking. You realize that many of the same critical skills that you use for problem solving are the same critical skills for essays, the same critical skills for art criticism. And ultimately, when you're doing art criticism, you are writing down what it is that you are evaluating. And so we see that a lot of these skills cross disciplines. So if you are going to be able to identify and describe, that means that you're examining every aspect of the work. This includes the shapes, the colors, the values, and the textures. You need to be able to describe where are these visual qualities located within the piece, or where do they need to be identified. What illusions, and that includes obvious and subtle, of form, space, and gesture exist. All right, because that's what a painting is. It is an illusion. There is a famous piece, "This is not a pipe," or "This is not a peace pipe," for that matter. And it's only a picture of one. And in many ways, what you're looking at is an abstraction from reality, because the artist has chosen to select certain details to amplify and portray to you and leave other details out. So there is always a measure of illusion involved in art. So some of it's very obvious, some of it's very subtle, and whether it be in form, space, and gesture. You need to be able to ask, how are perceptions and observations that you and others have going to be expressed by the critic? And are they going to be valid interpretations? In other words, is your interpretation valid? Would it hold true now? Would it hold true if applied to other works of art and other artists? Are you using the same set of standards, for example, as you evaluate one artist as you do another within a certain movement? This includes Native American art. And if qualities within the artwork are not observed, what could happen is your response could be stunted and your appreciation could be limited. In other words, if your perception is inadequate, you are doing injustice in many ways. Then, like you might have heard of stunted growth, all right, or limited growth. That's what occurs. You could call it limited criticism. And for that matter, if the qualities that you ascribe to the work don't exist in it, then the response is invalid. This is going to be an important concern by Nancy Meithlo, who we'll talk about in another part of this lesson, because we're going to understand that many of the critics of Native American art really don't have the equipment cognitively and culturally to effectively critique Native American art in the contemporary and sometimes the historic sense. You need to be analytical. What are the characteristics of the work? How has the work been organized? How does it appear on the picture plane? How does it appear in the 2- or 3-dimensional form? How does it sound? How does it taste if you're criticizing food, which I tend to think of as art? Are the visual qualities arranged primarily symmetrically or asymmetrically? All right, is there a sense of symmetry within a piece, or do they appear to be not random, but they are only in relation to each other, but not to achieve a sense of balance, but in many balance, but to achieve a sense of tension? All right, these are things that you look at with visual qualities. Which colors or textures or shapes dominate? Because of whether it's be their relative size to each other or repeated use of different colors, textures, or shapes. These are all part of the analysis of a work of art. It includes also what implied or actual movements can be identified. And that's not only movements within the piece, but movements within a historical context. Are the contrasts among and between the visual qualities obvious and conflicting, subtle and harmonious? All right, when you look at a piece, does it seem chaotic? Are there qualities that are obvious, easy to discern, or you really have to look at it deeply and intensely to get more of an idea of what the artist is trying to accomplish? This is what drove a lot of people crazy about Jackson Pollock and his drip paintings. Unless you start to look at enough of them, you start to understand there is a reason to drip painting, and that there actually was a bit of mastery to it. But in many ways, Jackson Pollock, as a non-native artist, was fortunate that he had a critic by the name of Clement Greenberg who happened to like his work, and so he was able to succeed in this time period of what we would call abstract expressionism. But we're looking at all of these aspects in the analysis. And then when we're interpreting, and this is another important part when we're looking at cross-cultural interpretations, what emotions and thoughts are evoked that are based on our observations? Are we able to identify elements of the work that evoke emotions and thoughts? And for that matter, are we aware of our bias? That includes our bias towards certain artists, towards certain medium, towards certain themes, towards certain cultures, towards certain movements. These are all bias, all right, ways that we tend to favor certain things and disfavor others. So these are all important dynamics in interpretation of art too, which plays an overall set of characteristics and tasks that we have when we are starting to work as and act as an art critic. Ultimately then, as a critic, we are making some type of judgment. And all of our judgments are made in a context. And that includes a city that we reside in, our mood, as well as a period in history. And our judgment then is going to be the success, the worth of the work. And then if we're making that assessment about something succeeds and it is a valuable, it's worth looking at, it's worth appreciating rather than walking on to the next station. What evidence or reasoning do we have to support our judgment? What is the basis for our judgment? What are the reasons we have to make to come to this judgment about the work or works that we are looking at? And for that matter, what comparisons are we making about the relative success or worth as they are related to other artists, to other time periods in which works were being made, and as well as within other artistic movements? And now what we're going to include is the sense of not only personal, but cultural context too, and cultural bias, because it can have a strong effect on the way that we critique art. And one of the things that Nancy Meiflo talks about in her introductory essay in the Manifestations text is this notion that many people who are making these judgments aren't in a position to make these judgments because they don't have a contextual awareness. So very often non-scholarly analysis and non-scholarly judgments are made about Native American art by non-native critics. And this is what we look at now in much more detail as we are moving into this important text on Native American art and Native American art criticism in the contemporary sense. So in many ways, if we accept a designation of an artist, if we claim to be an artist, we are tacitly accepting to be criticized too then, because if we say we are an artist, we're putting something out there to be appreciated. Therefore, if people can accept it or reject it, they're doing so for certain reasons. In other words, we are putting ourselves out there to be criticized. So when you call yourself an artist, you are, in many ways, accepting also to be criticized for your art. Otherwise, why put anything out there? However, criticism is an exercise in voice, and this is an important dynamic in postmodern thinking too, which many people talk about postmodern art criticism as being a struggle for power. And we'll go about that in a little bit more detail in a future lesson about this sense of postmodern, and postmodern in many ways being a battleground between disenfranchised and enfranchised people. But what happens when people who have been criticized start to become the critics? In other words, what happens when groups who have been subject to criticism start to take charge of the critique? Because they are going to be doing so with a different set of eyes than those who are outside looking in. In other words, it would be an insider's view looking out. So what occurs? So, New Native Art Criticism, Manifestations, the book that's published by the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, that Nancy Meiflo et al. Being the editors, as well as guest essays by various art critics and students who are aspiring and already are contemporary Native American art critics, and it also features works by many contemporary Native American artists. So this is an important revelation here, and it's an important work, because what it is now suggesting is that there hasn't been much on Native American art criticism in the contemporary sense, and this is almost like a throwing down of a gauntlet, a declaration, a manifesto, a declaration of purpose, all right, that this is going to happen. And many of the people that you read, not only in the longer essays, but in the shorter descriptions of artists, are going to be your future critics in the Native American contemporary art world, and ultimately the global art world. Now, something that was described by Vine Deloria in several of his works, but then that Nancy Meiflo also amplifies on, is that in many ways that Native Americans, and for that matter, Native American artists, are subject to what could be called schizophrenic expectations. In other words, there has been a very strong movement to assimilate Native Americans from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and then at the same time, while there is a strong sense to assimilate and become Americans, that in doing so they have to remain authentically pure to them. How can you assimilate and be authentically pure at the same time? This is a schizophrenia that Vine Deloria as well as Nancy Meiflo talk about, because there are Native American cultures and peoples and artists have been in this really strange place of being art and craft, of being pulled into the art world for economic development initially rather than artistic plausibility, and this being an important part of early legislations, whether it be the General Allotment Act and then the Merriam Report, which criticized the Allotment Act and said we need to emphasize that we need to instigate, that we need to encourage economic development in Native American communities on reservations through arts, and at the same time that various schools of artists in the United States are starting to look at Native American artists for spiritual as well as aesthetic inspiration. So there is some type of, as was talked about in earlier works, of Native American painting, as well as this sense of intercultural stuff that Barnett Newman was trying to accomplish. There is this cross-fertilization that's occurring, so that it's all right for American artists to be inauthentic and to borrow from everybody, but this sense that Native Americans should that are assimilated still, their work needs to be pure. There is that to some degree, and that is starting to fall to the wayside. But it is this kind of tension that Native artists face that just American artists don't face. And what's happening here is that we have cultures of trauma that are continuing to create works that reflect tribal values with traditional as well as contemporary media. And they also are continuing to create certain objects that were valued traditionally using contemporary media, or that were valued traditionally using traditional media, but are presenting them in a contemporary market, such as Santa Fe Indian Market. So there is a whole different set of circumstances that's occurring with Native American artists who are doing contemporary traditional work or contemporary avant-garde work, all right, cutting-edge work. And this still comes to this dynamic as someone authentically pure, because authentically pure also involves a person's certificate of Indian birth, all right, or their band enrollment. All right, you're licensed to be Indian, whether it be from the Indian Arts and Crafts Act or the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. This sense that if you don't have your CIB, then you can't show at Indian Market. All right, this is also part of this being authentically pure. And so we need to be aware of these various factors, because there has been a phenomenon that's known as ethnic fraud, where people have posed as Native American artists to sell their work in an art market that was exploding. An interest of purchasing works by Native American artists, so people could pass for being Indian. Ironically, during the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of Native Americans who wanted to pass for being Italian or Greek, or would never mention, children of Native families would never mention that they were Native American because they were trying to assimilate. So these are some of the dynamics that we are looking at in a contemporary sense: contemporary Native artists, contemporary Native American work in a contemporary time. I now want to amplify on a few pull-out quotes from Meithlow's essay to add even a little bit more deeper layers of meaning. So when Nancy writes, because artistic appraisals of Native arts, the formal qualities, iconic meaning, centrality to contemporary art dialogues are largely unarticulated, confusion results in scholarly and market settings about their work. In other words, that there is some confusion about Native American art in a contemporary sense, and that includes about not only the formal qualities, but what different symbols mean, and for that matter, how what is being presented in the work is central to an important part of contemporary art dialogue. All right, that because there aren't a lot of Native American art critics that are doing this work, and that the critics who are doing it are the outside looking in and really cannot interpret some of the icons, for example, there is a lot of confusion because people are making decisions with limited information. And this in many ways is a call for various Native scholars to come to the fore, if they care to, and take part in this important work in art criticism and this important work in art history, but history itself, because we do look at art as being, we could say, three-dimensional, two-dimensional, and ephemeral representations of ideas, of thoughts, of people's places in history, tangible representations of culture. And it's important then to have this as an important as a critical part of the dialogue that's being made about Native American art, but also about Native American art history and Native American history, because the artists are portraying very often social, cultural, political events that are going on not only in their communities, but are going on globally or within the nation. But if there is this kind of confusion, then the infrastructures, such as publications that feature criticism in history, collections that feature objects, professional training, which includes art curation and conservation, that are necessary to the field of Native American art history, they're compromised, all right, which leads to a disenfranchisement, all right, that people become separated from the global art market, and for that matter, the cultural art market, the global understanding of art, and the global understanding of art history. Now, this is not to say that the global art history is going to assimilate Native American contemporary art, but to show it as we mentioned earlier in the semester with McMaster, it's a separate set of art histories that converge and diverge at different points. But what we're seeing here in particular is that Native American artists are jumping into the foray in the global art market or the national art market or the local art market. And if there isn't the infrastructure to support the criticism, to support the understanding for the work that artists are producing, then they become separated from the dialogue, from the history, from the very strong sense of a participation, not only as an individual, but as an individual within a cultural, within a national, and even a global context. And so this disenfranchisement occurs not only with the artists, but the galleries who show the work, the museums, and the academy, all right, the universities. And there is a good amount of confusion that is still out there, as Meitlow asserts. And therefore, then, the appraisals of quality or excellence in American Indian art are largely construed on formal assessments alone. In other words, a lot of the work that's interpreted by critics are done based on the formal elements, all right, shape, color, texture, rhythm, repetition, because they don't have an understanding of indigenous knowledge systems. They don't have an understanding of indigenous symbol systems and iconic meaning systems, or for that matter, don't have a strong understanding of Native American art history, which would show why certain symbols or certain ideas and even colors would come to the fore. All right, so objects that have been made and circulated in American Indian communities, both urban and rural, We see this, they are valued for the knowledge and memory they contain, not just for the decorative or utilitarian qualities alone. This comments on this notion that art is a community creation and that it's valued because of the knowledge and the memory that various works contain, that they are made to be used. They are not just decorative. And so, in other words, they're not just art for art's sake. And so this is also a part of the confusion as part of the disenfranchisement that can occur with art criticism when it's done from the outside looking in. An important thing to consider too, and when we look at art as being multi-sensory, we also need to look at art as being multi-emotional, that art evokes a whole range of emotions in us. There are not good emotions. There are just emotions. It's what we do with them that could be positive or negative, but they are just emotions, right? And the way that we react to them are just reactions. And something to include within an aesthetic then is including pain within appreciation of beauty. All right, and so when Nancy writes, I think there's an aesthetic beauty to addressing painful legacies that American Indian people have pure access to in endless amounts of quantities and form. We could say the same thing about Syria. We could say the same thing about artists in Iraq, the same thing about artists in parts of South Africa, as well as Botswana, any place where there is culture trauma, any place there is culture pain. That there is a beauty to the way that people address it too. What do they portray? How do they portray it? How effectively are they portraying it? To what degree is that what they are portraying an aspect of community values, cultural values, individual values, and norms? But the stories here, in this case Native American art, they're unparalleled. The imagery developed over thousands of years, remarkable. The power of the compositions unmatched. We see this within a cultural context within the United States. But we could apply the same principle across the world, all right, when we're looking at the art of culture pain. Not individual pain, all right, not the art of some tortured artist, but we're looking at artists who are portraying the culture trauma that they've experienced, right? And this is an important part when we're evaluating art and market too, because very often if you paint a work, if you portray a work that is going to bring up bad memories for people, or for that matter, portray others in a bad light, you stand a strong sense of not selling it. All right, it's not going to be a very popular work. A lot of people don't like to look at pain, and they don't like to look at a lot of criticism that is directed at their culture. So it's very important that we understand that we have to include pain and the expression of pain as part of aesthetic. That it's not always things being nice, not always things being beautiful, that there's an aesthetic of the ugly that's important to understand when we're looking at world art, not just Native American art, when we're looking at contemporary art, not just historic art, but this aesthetic of pain. As well as an aesthetic as it relates to memory. Because in many parts of the world, the process of colonialism did result in the creation of art. An irony being that sometimes what they call tourist trash or airport art that work is being created as a direct result of countries being colonized, being gutted in their economies, people's lifestyles being upset as they were exploited, and now they are left having to try to make ends meet by creating works that people who come to visit the country that they once controlled that is now run by others. And people want to buy souvenirs, and they buy what they call tourist art, tourist trash, airport art. And this is another part of that ugly aesthetic, an aesthetic of pain. But we understand that this process of colonialism, which is very extractive, very violent, resulted in the creation of art, and that includes in the United States, Mexico, Canada, and South America. So there's tenacious creative expression in the midst of rapid culture trauma and rapid culture change when we're looking at contemporary Native American art. But we have to understand this is art of memory, but also art of the future. That it's art of what we might say even of an optimism. Right? Even when you express pain, a sense that I'm here to express pain. That we survived. We survived our own apocalypse, and here we are to tell the story. That's why it's very important to be aware of the context, why it's so critical that we understand context, historical, cultural, and even tribal, and then to the individual. in understanding the potency of the imagery that we're looking at when we're appreciating works by various contemporary Native American artists. An important question related to criticism that Meithlo brings out after hearing this question addressed in a symposium. Is there bad Indian art? And I say yes. And there's also good Indian art. And there's also art that's now thought of as being good that was once thought of as being bad, and vice versa. But we find out that there are actually at least two variables that affect the critique as this question is asked. And two of those variables are things that affect this evaluation, is that there are distinctions and evaluations that are made in the context of arts institutions and a commercial market. All right, and so that as being something that affects the critique, because if it sells, then it must be good. Well, maybe we still see that sometimes people are buying work they don't understand. And they're buying it because it represents a stereotype of what they think Native American art should look like, rather than what Native American art really is as expressive of contemporary artistic values. And is something being made for market? Is it being made because it'll sell? Because they know that people like to buy paintings with feathers and pottery in them. These are very often then these distinctions and evaluations are made at art institutions, and many of the institutions don't have curators that are, you might say, skilled in curating, and they don't have historians that have a solid knowledge of Native American art history and as well as Native American history. And so we see it not only in the museums and the galleries, but we see it in the commercial market too. That another important factor is the nature of the critical arts reviews that appear in the various journals, papers, popular press, etc. You won't find a lot of Native American art critics until only recently publishing quite a bit about critiquing not only Native American contemporary art, but critiquing contemporary art in general. So what happens is the native arts field is susceptible to the whims of informal evaluations. Informal meaning that it's not just a layperson, but people who may not have the important cultural context, cultural history, background to be able to make these important criticisms as well as distinctions between good or bad art. So this is when we say, is there bad Indian art? Yes, indeed there is. There's bad art, there's good art. And ultimately what we look at too, though, is that how effectively is a message communicated? How much is it appreciated too? How successful is the work in communicating what it's supposed to do? There are silent forces that affect the critique. There are actually non-intellectual sources that guide the assessment for contemporary native arts. And that includes, Indian traders, all right, that are assessing rugs and textiles. And they may be very good at it, but they're looking at it through a very specialized set of ideas, because they may only deal, for example, in textiles. But we're also looking at people who are selling what we could call kitsch, people who are they're second or third party sellers, that they're buying jewelry, for example, and they're buying it wholesale and then selling it retail. And so this also can assess contemporary American Indian art. Santa Fe, Gallup Tucson is full of people who sell contemporary Native art, but may not be actually well versed in contemporary Native American art or art history. So you could also have the cultural art of the week variety, writing that's exerted a harmful influence on the development of a more serious field of inquiry. And that kind of art of the week variety of arts writing could appear in various trade publications. And that includes things like Santa Fe, and that includes things like even Indian Market magazine itself, right? Because they are appealing to a market. And a market appeal is very different than an historical commentary and historic critique. That if you're looking at Pasatiempo, if you're looking at various Today magazines and the like, they're looking at what's popular, but not necessarily what's important in contemporary Native American art history, as would have been designated by natives, artists and critics on the inside looking out. So good Indian art, then, as Meiflo would assert, is that it successfully conveys the unique cultural experiences of indigenous life in the Americas. Good art in the settings we generally define as fine arts venues cannot be said to follow the same standards of evaluation. In other words, the way that we would look at good art in the Museum of Modern Art, in the Guggenheim, in the National Gallery of Art, you really cannot use that same set of standards of whether it's good or not then would be used in evaluating contemporary Native American art, as Meiflo would assert. And this is one of these things about being a critic, because this particular statement here is one that will be batted around. Because people will say, well, if you want to be part of the contemporary art world, then you have to be willing to become tacitly accepting of contemporary art criticism, and that art criticism transcends culture. So this is in one way where Meiflo is taking a stand about what is good Indian art, that it actually has to have this dynamic of conveying culture experience that are unique to indigenous life in the Americas. That's an important statement. It's an important argument to make, and other authors in the text in various ways contributes to the strength of that argument of what is good Indian art. Native art, historic and contemporary, then, is therefore often put on exhibit. And if it's going to be done so, Meiflo suggests the criteria that would exist in an indigenous curatorial methodology. And she suggests 4 of them. And so as we would see art in museums and culture centers, where we see there are permanent collections as compared to galleries where you have a fluid collection because artworks are being sold or brought there and then removed. This is different because in a museum and in a culture center, museums themselves as cultural institutions in the United States, and then culture centers in American Indian communities with the intent of maintaining culture, that these are an important part of the contemporary art world. And that what we see as being contemporary now at some time is going to be historic. All right, Allan Hauser didn't know that he was going to be a historic artist. Didn't know that his work was going to be at the White House. Didn't know that he was going to be a internationally recognized artist when he was painting murals at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior. So when we're looking at this sense of in a contemporary time, understanding that this has to be a long-term relationship, because what's contemporary now is going to be historic at some time. So you need to be aware of this sense of long-term, but also to have a long-term commitment to it as an indigenous curator when you're looking at Native American contemporary works. Because as a curator, you are also making evaluations. You are also a critic, because you are, by your choices of what to exhibit or what to cause a museum to collect, you are making editorial, you are making critical decisions about the value of a work and how it fits into a museum or culture center's collection. So it's important to have a long-term commitment to this so that you see things in not only the contemporary, but the historic as well as a future sense. That curatorial methodology has to be reciprocal. In other words, everyone benefits. And that's not just the artist and the museum and the culture center, but the community itself. And that includes in some ways then what the access to work on a continued basis for the long term. That relationship between a curator and any museum or culture center has to be mutually meaningful. That everyone has to be able to grow within this and gain meaning in this experience. And that it includes mentorship. In other words, that a community itself can mentor a curator or an artist, or for that matter, an artist or a curator can mentor community members too. So that's also part of that reciprocity where things go both ways. And that does include mentorship, because a community is going to share its history and for that matter share history through various artists who are representative of various communities. So a methodology has to include an awareness of mentorship. And these criteria, as are delineated here then, are central to an attitude of trust, and as well as the outcomes of planning exhibitions, of authoring essays, building curriculum, and marketing art and marketing contemporary Native American art. And so as we are evaluating this essay by Meifel, we're understanding that there is in many ways what we could suggest is a shortage of contemporary Native art critics who are coming out of the inside looking out view from an indigenous perspective, because there are plenty of Native American art critics that really don't have, you might say, the credentials or the cross-cultural or cultural understanding to really effectively or validly critique Native American art. That we also have to include various, we have to extend our sense of aesthetic to include trauma, to include pain as part of beauty, to be able to appreciate the tenacity of cultures, that they continued in the midst of drastic change to create work as they stood in their house after it's burned and decided what were they going to do with their lives. The sense of, after we've had this culture cataclysm, what do we do? Right? It's the equivalent of someone's house burning down and they're left with nothing, yet they still have to continue. And out of this type of trauma are still able to create things that are beautiful, sometimes maybe painfully beautiful, sometimes maybe painful, and may appear ugly, but we can appreciate the beauty and the tenacity of not only the individual, but the culture in which that individual resides to continue to create art in a contemporary time, and to continually put that work out there for evaluation, not only from the inside looking out from Native American curators and critics, but you might say the task that's incumbent upon Native American critics and curators to educate, inform, and illuminate those on the outside looking in for a deeper understanding of how contemporary Native art fits not only in the various indigenous cultural context, but how it fits into a global context where the history converges and where the history diverges.